First, I would like to thank the organizing committee of 17th Annual Conference of RASE, especially Professor H.S. Chandalia and Professor Ranawat for giving me an opportunity to deliver a brief introduction to Professor Galin Tihanov. I am glad and feel privileged to introduce one of the prominent figures in comparative literature, Professor Galin Tihanov. Professor Galin Tihanov is the George Steiner Professor of Comparative Literature at Queen Mary University of London. He was previously Professor of Comparative Literature and Intellectual History and founding co-director of the Research Institute for Cosmopolitan Cultures at the University of Manchester. Professor Tihanov has published widely on German, Russian, and East European cultural and intellectual history. He is the author of 6 books and co-editor of 10 volumes of scholarly essays. Some of his books and articles have been translated into Bulgarian, Chinese, Danish, French, German, Hungarian, Macedonian, Polish, Portuguese, Romanian, Russian, and Slovene. His current research is on world literature, cosmopolitanism, and exile. Amongst his recent authored and edited books are Regimes of Relevance and a companion to the works of Herman Roach. Professor Tihanov is a winner with Evgeny Dobrenko of the Efim Etkind Prize for Best Book on Russian Culture in 2012. He was also awarded for their co-edited book titled A History of Russian Literary Theory and Criticism, the Soviet Age and Beyond in 2011. He is honorary president of the ICLA Committee on Literary Theory, member of Academia Europaea, honorary scientific advisor to the Institute of Foreign Literatures at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and member of the advisory board of the Institute for World Literature at Howard University. Professor Tihanov has held visiting appointments at Yale University, St. Gallen University, the University of Sao Paulo, Peking University, Seoul National University, and the Higher School of Economics, Moscow, and research fellowships from Leverhulme Trust, AHRC, the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, the Open Society Foundation, and Collegium Budapest. His latest book, Regimes of Relevance, has been published by Stanford University Press in 2019. Professor Tihanov is well versed with more than 6 languages, including Bulgarian, German, Russian, Polish, etc. I, on behalf of the entire team of 17th Annual Conference of RASE, welcome Professor Tihanov to deliver his talk. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be joining you, and I'm very grateful for this very generous introduction by...
Oh, ma'am, you want to say something? Yeah, exactly. I think that I'm the moderator of the session. Am I? Yeah.
Oh.
Am I the moderator?
Please answer. Heminder sir, please unmute yourself and answer. Heminder sir will answer that question actually.
No, she is, in fact.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So just, I'll take a few minutes, Professor Galin, with your permission. We have come after a tea break, and I love to trigger this session for you. This is second plenary session of this conference, and we have you, Professor Galin, and we have our chairperson, Professor Amit Singh Ji from University of Sirsa. And it's really a privilege to be a part of this session with two important speakers and with such an elaborate introduction of yours, Professor Galin. It's really impressing for me. Just to give a head start to that, as we know that the process of globalization, it has created new challenges for writers, for we as readers, for artists, and even filmmakers. The world appears as a closer space. Let's take example from metropolitan cities like New York or Sydney or New Delhi or Bombay. We see that these cities, they reflect each other and they have somewhere acquired a homogenized space. Literature, we see that it somewhere looks at the nuances and the uniqueness of these culturally different spaces, including history and memory. So this webinar of ours, it interlinks and it explores. I hope I'm audible. Okay. So this webinar, it interlinks and it explores the multi-layered and complex task of writing, whether it's translation or transcreation or adaptation. And these processes, they involve a lot of appropriation and reappropriation, at times transgression and cultural transformations from multiple standpoints. So any work of writing, it has multiple negotiations. You can see that on the level of time and space, where there are simultaneity of events, and we have the time lapses, and there is space like geographical spaces and the psychological spaces, individual or collective, and culturally produced spaces. So this and much, much more we expect in this webinar. And it's really interesting to see that you, Professor Galin, you are from comparative literature. And we love to see that how you negotiate between these literatures coming from different cultural backgrounds. So I invite you for your plenary address, as well as Professor Umed Singh ji, to please chair this session. And thanks for giving me this opportunity to trigger this session for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shiva. And again, I'm very pleased to be here. And thank you for the invitation to join the 17th conference of the Rajasthan Association for English Studies. Thank you in particular to Professor Hemendra Chandelier, to Arpit Kotari, and to all of you. As you know, today I will speak on the resistance to theory and on the need to differentiate between theory and poetics across different cultural zones. The resistance to theory that has of late been building up in the humanities has everything to do with the global transition to a new regime of knowledge production, away from the disinterested thinking the West has been privileging for several centuries. We are today irresistibly involved in a move towards participatory knowledge, a new regime of knowledge production in which the practical situatedness and self-interest of the participants play a very important role. This important role we no longer seek to conceal, but are instead happy to emphasize and promote, foregrounding the legitimacy of this new mode of cognition that is pragmatic rather than disembodied and deductive. We should also take into account here the huge presence of the new social media, which have transformed our notion of truth and authority and have reinforced experiential modes of inquiry that are terribly self-centered and thus have little time for norms and criteria distilled in a bindingly rational and abstract manner. When it comes to literary theory, I think there is every reason to reassert and rearticulate its demise in terms that would do justice to the particular constellation of factors I have just described. In my 2019 book, which Dr. Kothari very kindly mentioned, I argued that the main reason why literary theory is no longer possible in the concentrated and self-sufficient form in which it was until the 1980s is because literature itself has transitioned to a different regime of relevance. In this different regime of relevance, I wish to claim now, it can no longer be an object of contemplation, supported by theoretical abstraction and detachment, but paradoxically secured by the erotic energy of attachment to a self-evident, always European, sometimes American, almost never non-Western canon. Some of it instantly available through memorization or other acts of institutionally induced repetition. Instead, literature becomes once again openly instrumentalized, and this pragmatic stance that traverses the entire spectrum of political affiliations and civilizational identifications redefines our approach to it. Remember William James and the great lessons of American pragmatism. Truth cannot be argued over or distilled through disinterested procedures of contemplation or theorization, because truth is forever amalgamated with how we use things and to what ends. Literary theory, sustained as it was during the 70 or so years of its existence by a notion of distance and detachment, attitudes that were ultimately doing justice to the treasured autonomy of literature, and at the same time by a certitude stemming from the loving immersion in a profoundly shared, again, always European, sometimes American, almost never non-Western cultural inheritance, crumbled in the face of this new regime of relevance. This new regime re-emphasized literature's significance away from its aesthetic or literary features, away from the master attitude of detachment and distance, and into a sphere of proactive private and public use. But also, crucially, it placed literature in the uncertain and contested playing field of a radically heterogeneous cultural landscape. All this takes me to another important reason for the growing resistance to theory, related to the ones I have just discussed, but not identical with them. This reason is valid with reference to both projects of theory, not just theory with a small t, for example, literary theory, but also theory with a capital T, largely coinciding with 20th century continental philosophy or the dialectical method in its various facets. And I recently published an article that differentiates between these two meanings and projects of theory. Theory as a project of Western modernity, for better or worse, has always been underwritten by a deeply held belief in the possibility of disembodied thinking. Precisely because of its disembodied nature, this thinking held a universalizing intent, which in turn would enter into unholy alliance with various projects of expansionism and colonization. Nikolai Trubetskoy in Europe and Mankind sends out a very clear message that this disembodiment is in the end illusionary. Yet theory has been driven all along by this blind spot. Its claims to universality have been possible until recently because it has found itself historically sheltered from the necessity to reflect on its own Western situatedness and embeddedness. A part of the story of disembodied and universalizing thinking is, for example, Hegel's phenomenology, just as another part is the work of the Russian formalists. The formalists genuinely believed that the material
There's an audibility problem. We are not able to listen to you, Professor Galin. Please unmute yourself.
Somebody muted me.
Okay.
There was a message on my screen that I was muted. So the formalists genuinely believed that the material they were reflecting upon had universal significance and applicability. Thus, it didn't really occur to them to seriously test their hypothesis on samples of writing drawn from other cultural contexts. Arabic literature, Chinese literature, Sanskrit or Hindi literature are very much expunged from their literary Eden. They were rightly criticized for this by a young contemporary, the budding Orientalist, at the time still a PhD student at Leningrad, Alexander Kolodovich. The future Koreanist asked formalists in earnest how they would afford to claim universal validity for their theoretical insights, given that the material on which their analysis were based was almost exclusively Western, European, with a sprinkling of American literature. This set of objections to Russian formalism has remained overlooked by historians of literary theory, but it is much more important, productive, and difficult to deflect than the staple ideological accusations formulated by Soviet Marxism. I want now to move to discussing a central factor in this resistance to theory, and this is the significance of migration. The difference between exile and migration becomes essential here. Exile is an individual experience. Migration places mobility, which Professor Shiva mentioned, in the frame of mass experience, and thus gives us a very different prism on the encounters between the West and a whole number of powerful cultural zones in which literature functioned differently for centuries and was reflected upon with a different methodological toolkit, that of poetics rather than theory as such. If we look at Shklovsky, Jakobson, Trubetskoy, Lukács, Auerbach in Istanbul, where pro-Western cultural reforms were championed by Atatürk, or even Todorov and Kristev, the next generation, where the boundary between exile and migration becomes more blurred. Their experience of mobility was no doubt an experience of cultural encounters with otherness, but this experience was still evolving in the relatively homogeneous cultural environment of the West, Europe and America. Today's reality of mass migration confronts us with an altogether different experience. According to the United Nations, the number of migrants and refugees currently approaches 80 million. Let us imagine an entire country with a population the size of Germany or Turkey, unbound, relocated, and dispersed, sometimes forcefully, forming vast and unstable contact zones, conglomerates of cultural fluidity and heterogeneity. This experience of mass migration has fed into a sober recognition of the non-binding nature of the Western aesthetic and cultural experience and of the canon of European or Western literatures. Ever since the 1960s, we have witnessed the gradual loss of certainty over the alleged universality of the Western canon. Not by chance, I maintain, did the crisis and protracted dissolution of literary theory coincide with the crisis of the Western canon that was already plain for all to see by the mid-1980s. Having lost the hermeneutic self-evidence of its evidential basis, the Western canon, theory, literary but also social, anthropological, historiographical, hit a buffer, reaching the limits of its own validity in how it identifies and seeks to reflect on phenomena that cannot be conceptually tamed with the frameworks of disembodied thinking. I argue that the dialectic of globalization, to evoke and modify Adorno and Horkheimer, is a powerful factor in the current resistance to theory. Globalization has opened up the space beyond its initial and concomitant effects of leveling out and commodifying difference to an appreciation of the highly complex constitution of culture, of which the patterns and models worked out in the course of European and American history are anything but compelling or universal. In brief, the unprecedented mobility, physical but crucially also virtual, which we have been living with since the 1990s, and especially since the start of the 21st century, has brought home the truth of the rather limited and conditional nature of the Western cultural inheritance on which theory was built and on which it thrived. Theory contemplated the riches of this legacy in a way that was endearingly loyal at best and disturbingly naive throughout. This is what has been fueling and sustaining the resistance to theory, both with capital and small t, over the last couple of decades. The growth of participatory knowledge, as well as the powerful redrawing of the cultural map that has made the Western canon of philosophy, literature, art, social and political thought far less binding, have fostered a skeptical stance towards theory. World theory has never been possible because the world we have is one, but not unitary, as we know. It has rather always been a force field of competing powers that shape its many segments in a way that does not allow us to order them into a seamless whole. The benign misconception that the shards of world theory are there to be collected and restored to their past wholeness should take a backseat and recognize the futility of the task. It should give way to a careful examination of propositions drawn from non-Western cultural zones, not because they are quirky, mildly exotic, or refreshingly peripheral, but because they offer alternative modes of reflection on literature, including world literature, on philosophy, political theory, and so on. We need to be mindful, in other words, of the fact that world theory is not a possibility, because, to put it briefly, theory has not been the primary mode of reflection on literature beyond the Western tradition. I hinted earlier in this text that other equally powerful cultural zones have not been so enthralled by theory. In fact, in these zones, China and the Middle East would be good examples. There has not been, historically speaking, much demand for theory. And in other ways, this, I hope you would agree, is true of the Indian subcontinent as well. Instead, literature would be reflected upon in these cultural zones through the equally enabling prism of poetics, a very different prism indeed. Literary theory derives its specificity from being the outcome of a particular historical negotiation over the place literature occupies vis-à-vis the state and its institutions, vis-à-vis religion and other important societal factors. And only in conjunction with, and sometimes in the invisible shadow of, these larger emancipatory developments does literary theory emerge as a specific mode of reflection on literature. This negotiation, or if you prefer, emancipatory struggle, took place in the West in ways it would not occur in China or the Middle East until very recently. And even when it did occur there, the outcome has been less clear-cut and more circumspect. China and the Middle East remained over a very long time cultural zones in which sophisticated poetics thrived, and its impact in these cultures has endured. But literary theory in the European, including Russian understanding of it, was not a major presence. All this is just a neutral description of a historically induced difference, a profound difference, in how these cultures have related to the place and tasks of literature in society. Literary theory operates from the premise that literature has become an autonomous discourse. And it is this fundamentally new condition of literature, its autonomy, that literary theory essentially engages. Poetics operates from the premise that the literary text has always been autonomous because it resides in harmony with the larger spheres of politics and religion without ever being seriously tempted to challenge them. Poetics thus describes literature as a writing that has never been dynamically involved in interaction with, or crucially, in opposition to the state and its institutions, to religion and its infrastructure, etc. Let me illustrate this with a comparison. In Plato's famous Republic, especially Book 10, the poet is declared potentially dangerous and his expulsion from the polis is considered not inappropriate. Very early on, this shapes the relationship between literature and the state, literature and politics, ultimately literature and the polis and its collective causes, be they moral, political, much later often draped as national. All these relationships are cast as deeply antagonistic. This antagonism surfaces throughout the history of Western writing as one of its defining themes. Compare this with Confucius's understanding of the place of literature in society and vis-a-vis the state. In the Analects, chronologically roughly the same time as Plato's work, Confucius says in the Yang Huo chapter, I quote, "The poems serve to stimulate the mind. They may be used for purposes of self-contemplation. They teach the art of sociability. They show how to regulate feelings of resentment. From them, you learn the more immediate duty of serving one's father and the remoter one of serving one's prince." End of quote. The difference couldn't be more striking. Poetry is a means here of managing grievance. It is also a means of asserting authority in the household and in the state. It is meant to be integrated into the state rather than abide in a relationship of antagonism to it. In China, this conglutination of poetry and the state was institutionalized through the civil service examination system, of which classical poetry became a part in the 7th century AD and remained so all through to 1905. The purpose of this system was not to question tradition, let alone instill a sense of autonomy, but to perpetuate the state by reproducing the right skills of governance and of poetry making according to the canons of classical poetics. Thus, imagination and originality, the fountains of revolt against the subservient role of literature, and very much the building blocks of the idea of autonomy that came to the fore with European Romanticism, were not seen as have qualities in China. Whereas Shakespeare was to be refashioned, celebrated by the Romantics as an epitome of irregularity, wildness, creativity, and invention, not as the serial stealer or recycler of plots he often was. In China, even after the transition to writing in modern Chinese, with the first poem in modern Chinese appearing in 1917, as late as that, the fetishization of classical poetry and its poetics, with its pleasing and binding patterns of regularity, lingers on for a very long time to come. In Western Europe, on the contrary, there are longer or shorter waves, but not a continuous mainstream, of following the recipes of classical poetics, but these episodes largely conclude by the end of the 17th century. Just as important, it seems to me, is the fundamentally different way in which literature positions itself vis-a-vis religion, and this is my last argument. In the Middle East, the reign of poetics over theory has everything to do with the important consensus that the message of the Quran be not vague in terms of content. This message can only be rendered in poetically varying ways that make individual innovation and originality recognizable solely when projected onto the screen of tradition, with its established genres, metrics, stock imagery, rhetorical and compositional devices, etc. In China, too, literature historically did not find itself in a situation of having to claim its own territory by pushing against religion in what would, in the West, gradually constitute an act of secularization, with all the residual impact the Judeo-Christian inheritance would continue to exercise. In China, religion was structured in ways that would preclude such a dramatic pushback on the part of literature. There was, in a sense, little to push back against. No scripture as such, and no church that would guard over the purity of that scripture. And I think this very much inscribes the situation on the Indian subcontinent as well, in terms of religious variety. The canons of the three major doctrines in China, Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, did not crystallize around a single scripture, and they were guarded not by the church, but by the state, which would sometimes see it fit to destroy them. What is more, the underlying distinction between orthodox and heterodox is far less clear-cut and begins to assume sharper contours only with the arrival of Buddhism in China. In classical, pre-modern China, there are no words equivalent to the words religion, theology, or even priest. The word religion itself is a much, much later borrowing from the Japanese. Consider also this. Very early on, the canon of Confucianism includes classical Chinese poetry, and Confucius was even believed by many to have compiled and edited that part of the canon, the so-called classic of poetry, an assumption which has, of course, been refuted in modern sinology. To conclude, we thus see that genetically and typologically, literary theory is a Western product, again, for better or worse. And it wouldn't do full justice to either the Chinese or the Middle East cultural zones. And for various reasons, one should also include here, to some extent, also the vast realm of Persia and the Indian subcontinent. And Persia and the Indian subcontinent were often conjoined in the past. So theory would not do justice to these other cultural zones if we were to miss the fact that reflecting on literature there was not necessarily taking place through the prism of theory. Those of us in the West who have worked with Chinese scholars are sometimes impatiently awaiting their release of a Chinese literary theory, or a Persian or Indian for that matter. I have myself had such conversations with Chinese colleagues in the past. The reaction would be unfailingly polite, but not without a hint at the superfluity or even harmfulness of such attempts, essaying to produce a literary theory from a Chinese perspective runs the risk of having to accept the discursive rules of the West, giving up the belief in China being different, read independent from the West. And with that, the entire Western disposition of looking at literature through the prism of various antagonisms, sometimes latent, sometimes very explicit. Not forcing on China or the Middle East or Persia or the Indian subcontinent our expectations that they should come up with a literary theory of their own would be a good start on the long journey towards recognizing their specific historical and discursive constellations and their unique cultural resources. Thank you very much. Thank you.